Sure, thanks very much, Ellis. Tim, as you can see, is outside the Barrow on his family farm in Shropshire, which, as Ellis pointed out, I first learned about when we met discussing contributions to the Congregation exhibition. And I think what our conversation has been about really is that I think Tim did a law degree at Oxford. He's a long line of farmers and is a farmer. And I think you got a first, didn't you, Tim, I believe?
No, I very much didn't get a first. I've done a master's in agriculture since because I saw the light. So,
so you did the rugby and the drinking afterwards. But you're a good friend of Merlin Fulcher, aren't you?
That's right. He and I had rooms opposite each other in LMH in our first year, and we're great friends.
Yeah, and Merlin is kind of he works in the architecture world, but he's also involved in an art gallery, and he's a poet. And
right.
I guess your motivations for creating this they don't seem to be financial, they seem to be cultural, right? And in a form of kind of curiosity about the deeper dimension of being a landowner?
It's a very hard thing to articulate exactly why we're doing this 5 years after having started. I think there's a degree of wonder and magic, I think, in what's going on. I just correct you, Ellis. At the beginning you said I founded Sacred Stones. I did it. I farm here. The masons who built this monument behind me, which I'm going to show you in a second, built the first new long barrow for 5,500 years on my friend Tim Dawes' farm, which is down in All Canning, Spale of Pewsey, sort of not quite in the World Heritage area of Stonehenge, but that's kind of an arbitrary line, and it's definitely in that landscape. And what was built there was very, very beautiful, is very beautiful, and is captivating. And I saw an article or two about it. And then I ended up contacting Tim, and 5 years on, here we are. We haven't completed this monument as things stand. We could do it within the next month or two. We just could have put a stone corbelled roof over the second chamber and raise another earth bank to go beyond what's already here. But I think we're going to leave that open for a bit of cultural activity because of what's going on with the COVID situation at the moment. What I'll show you is a space that people can use in sort of a cultural way that's quite ventilated. So we're just sort of finding our way with that. You asked me why, Patrick, we did this. I think falling in love with what happened in Wiltshire, being a boy who was taken on holidays to Anglesey, to all of the barrows that survive on that landscape, and then being a farmer, I think. And then I suppose living in a community like Shropshire, which is, we're very lucky to still have quite old-fashioned sorts of community around here, where I think this is more easily possible than maybe other communities, I guess. I don't know. I'm handing it back to you, Patrick.
What I think is interesting is that there hasn't been an architect involved in the project, but you've been talking to a kind of wider community of astronomers and cosmologists and stonemasons, and have read widely. And what was really nice about the kind of alignment that Ellis alluded to is that when we met, the conversation seemed to kind of have a kind of trying to indicate depth. But you very modestly realised that or felt perhaps that that there was a context missing intellectually and kind of culturally that I might be able to fill people in on. I think that's why you thought it would be a good idea that we talk together. And then the other day, very helpfully, you explained to me via a film the physical and immediate context in which you're working. And so what I thought we'd do is that if I kind of try and situate what you're doing for you and for the audience, because it obviously seems a bit weird to say that you're building a Neolithic burial mound or a barrow. on your land, and people might kind of scratch their head and think, what on earth is he doing? That's something you expect to happen in Somerset, perhaps, or in a kind of, maybe in the 1970s. But what I brought to the party, I think, was that whilst I run a practice in London, we build housing and office buildings and coroner's courts and blah 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 blah, blah houses and blah blah blah. I did a Master of Philosophy degree at Cambridge with Dalla Wesley and Peter Carr, and my dissertation was about Baroque gardens. Then I did a PhD, which I've spoken about in a couple of these talks before, about the relationship between architecture, sculpture, and landscape. And so when you were saying things that you, I think, thought sounded a bit weird, I was kind of going, yeah, yeah, James Turrell was just doing that, and Chillida, and yeah, of course, that's what's going on in the Renaissance. And I think that context is probably worth expanding on a bit, because I think that it's arguable that what you're doing is operating in a kind of avant-garde liminal condition, but also something extremely archaic that doesn't deal with the teleological hierarchical idea of primitive and modern that's been dogging science and architecture and the visual arts for 100 years or so. And that's what I find so exciting about it. But in order to kind of demonstrate this and to illustrate it, we're going to sort of jump into a kind of lecture mode for a bit, and I'll try and do about 15 minutes or so, kind of just jump cut through the history of the underlying ideas about the ground and the sky that human beings that kind of do this, that end up being like that, kind of have this common horizon of human finitude, as it were, are dealing with. I thought one way that you guys might think about this is if that Ellis is like the bishop, Tim's like, he's like, I don't know, Lord Asriel or Lord Ashton, who's discovered stuff on his land and is evangelizing about it. And I've been tasked as the preacher to try to kind of situate the lesson for you. So stuff that might sound like it's beyond the pale and outside of the normal trajectory of the architectural canon might be brought into it in such a way that we can all situate ourselves in relationship to what Tim is going to show us in a bit. Because it is quite mind-bogglingly odd in a really good way. So cutting to the chase, this is a photograph that Tim took at about 5 a.m. On the 21st. That's it aligned to the rising sun on the longest day of the year. That's the second barrow, which is under construction. It has a kind of gnomon in the centre of it for setting out, and that really, that kind of axis mundi is at heart the kind of essence of the origins of man articulating themselves in relationship to the sky and death and life. This is something I designed. I wasn't going to talk about my work, but I thought suddenly I was actually going to justify why I'm talking about death beyond an academic perspective. And this is my father's tombstone, which sits in the grounds of a crematorium in Somerset. And the building regulations were that it could be no longer than 25 centimetres square and no taller than 5 centimetres off the ground. Surrounding him are mostly gypsies and other Irish travellers, and it's effectively a vase. And so what's clear is that there's this kind of whole cultural dimension about death that it is obviously at the moment, because people can't go to funerals with more than 6 people or so. My uncle died a few weeks ago from the dreadful disease in a nursing home. And so I'm kind of feeling very, very close to the issues that Tim is raising, sorry. And of course, only the other day, what's been revealed is that the object that we've been focusing on for centuries and kind of speculating about Stonehenge is actually part of something much bigger, and that the buildings that deal with death, the necropolis, is part of a much bigger cultural situation. And this is the way the modern world treats bits of stuff that we don't understand. We build towns over them, etc., etc. Now, there is a kind of deeper cosmic dimension to architecture and its urban character that I was first introduced to, probably like most of us, via this film where Indiana Jones disappears into the depths of a lost Egyptian city. And at midday on the summer solstice, I think, the position of the Ark of the Lost Covenant is revealed, and then he's buried in this barrow, as it were, this tomb. That's my father's thing. That's bits of Stonehenge and the immediate periphery, and that's the Indiana Jones scene that we all know and love. And this kind of social dimension to burial is something that is interesting anthropologists. This is a recent book from a few years ago, where anthropologists are starting to get involved in this stuff. So just to kind of situate what Tim is doing, this is something that's kind of 5,000 years old. Newgrange is a Neolithic burial mound, and it's part of a cluster of structures, and it's aligned to the rising sun on the winter solstice. And what recent drone technology and photomagnetic visualization is revealing in the case of Stonehenge and in Ireland is that there's this much bigger dimension of an architectural project, and in fact that it's absolutely linked to urbanity. And Newgrange, that's its environs, that's its alignment with the rising sun on the winter solstice, and this recent electromagnetic imagery which is revealing the depth of the urban condition. This is a model of the palace town of Knossos in Crete, which is the Minoan civilization. So this is where the myth of the Minotaur and the labyrinth comes from. In the 1920s and 30s, Arthur Evans, the English archaeologist, kind of rather fancifully reconstructed part of the hill. And there's a kind of dancing plane in the center. And crucially, for us, these columns are modeled on stalactites, which hang from the ceiling, obviously, in the cave facing the sea, which is where the Minoan culture evolved. And thus its religious rites are effectively a kind of precursor to the Platonic cosmic image of people in a cave with the gods beyond and light shining into the depths of matter. And so they effectively, when they built a city, recreated the barrow or the cave with these truncated columns, which led them down into the royal chamber, from which the boy god, the king, would descend each morning to receive petitions from his subjects. And that's obviously the symbol of the bull and the minotaur. And what's been slightly perverted in modern myth is the idea that the darkness and the depth was something horrific and terrible, that the bull who was mating unnaturally with the king's wife was put there out of shame. And of course, Ariadne provided through the thread a way for Theseus to escape. What's actually closer to the truth is that bulls were sacrificed on the plain, and in so doing, youths were not put to death. They learnt to dance over the bull. And so the bringing together of human ingenuity and skill did not, as the myth of Daedalus suggests, always involve kind of hubristic destruction, but a kind of joyful, ludic articulation of human agility and being. And in fact, people reconstruct this today, and it gave birth, obviously, it survives in the cult of the bullfight. Now, this kind of Platonic cosmic view of there being gods above and light and matter below, and human beings achieving a kind of horizon of musical and architectural and poetic articulation that dealt with this condition of being in between matter and godlike intelligence, was not something that was unique to Western civilization. That Joseph Rickver, amongst others, have pointed out, understood anthropologically the relationship between depth and ascent seems to be kind of coherent across cultures. The name of this Red Indian population has been lost to us, but equivalent with the building of the Pantheon in Rome were these amazing earthworks, which John Hancock at Arizona State University and his team are bringing to light. And they're effectively burial mounds and cosmically oriented metaphysical gardens. And of course in Rome, the creation of a kind of microcosmic pantheistic realm where you would enter and be part of the universe of the gods was only possible through the creation of a kind of barrow. That it's a load-bearing concrete construction. The resolution of the forces are taken away from the need for buttresses by allowing everything to fall against it. So the tensegrity structure gives us this perfect global image. They didn't have that view of the Earth at the time, but they had a kind of idea of cosmos operating a bit like a kind of celestial map. And of course you get this unbelievably strange experience. They stick a temple front on it, but the Roman Catholic Church has kind of adopted it with altars, but it's still absolutely bizarre. The key to this way of thinking is to articulate an anthropological dimension to architecture. So rather than looking at this purely as geometry or mathematics or form or style, what Joseph Rickver revealed is that the modernist understanding of the Roman city as something that was inherently militaristic is absolutely wrong and upside down. Instead, the military camp that the Romans established each night was laid out on a north, south, east, west cardinal axis of the Cardo and Decumanus. And in fact, that was a version of a clock. The essential logic of a labyrinth, it's not, in modern parlance, it's always seen as being a symbol of the chaotic, but in fact it's the opposite, because it only has one way out, is kind of adopted in Roman times. And anyway, the second part of Joseph's book attempts to demonstrate that this is not something that's unique to Western European culture. It's something that reappears in China and in Indian culture, and in fact remains beneath the surface. So the Renaissance city of Florence, the rebuilding of the Piazza della Repubblica, the Casa Vecchia, so Old Town Hall, it exists beneath the surface of what we're doing. At this time in the Renaissance, there was this kind of rebirth of an understanding of a kind of fusion of Platonic cosmology and Christian understanding of the universe, and so therefore the kind of myth of Orpheus and Eurydice and this kind of underworld and deeper psychological dimension of architecture as a gateway to something beyond, which you see in Dante's Divine Comedy, the kind of depths of the world being kind of modern quest, is writ large, where architectural symbols are part of the novel Hippomatikia Polyphili, to the extent that then that literary device becomes writ large in things like the Venante, built for Cardinal Gambetta on the outskirts of Rome and Viterbo, where it's absolutely essential to try to kind of visualize and make carnally, sensually aware this understanding of there being an underworld, a human horizon, and a world beyond. So the essential kind of descent of water falling from Mount Parnassus or Olympia. And then this is the bit of Deste where Diana is recast as this kind of earth mother, that something's bubbling up from below. And the humans are situated on this horizon. At Bamazzo, becomes a kind of version of a Sacrobosco, a Roman sacred wood, where in this case the landowner's wife dies, and he basically builds a gateway to the underworld where he can walk with her. So this, in a typical hill town, has within it this extremely exotic, strange world, truncated pyramids, mouths of hell that you enter. Architecture is kind of ruined, stage set, partly comic, partly tragic, effectively a place where he could wander with the dead, be part of a mythic dimension of reality. This is Hercules writ large, tearing people apart. It's kind of terrifying, it's also amusing. This reminds me of the beginning of A Matter of Life and Death by Michael Pressburger, where David Niven wakes on a beach and sees a goat herd with some sheep and thinks he's kind of in some kind of Grecian myth. Now, the English response to this, despite Inigo Jones spending 6 years in Rome, is predictably instrumental. His take on Stonehenge was that it was a Roman temple that had decayed. Along with his assistant Jonathan Webb, they tried to kind of rationalise and regularize myth. That's kind of ongoing endlessly. The Romantic tradition, i.e. the Galileans, as they were called, the painters in late 18th, early 19th century Germany, who were attracted to a kind of mythic dimension of Christianity and became Roman Catholics, were more interested in this kind of depth layer. So you see it in Friedrich, where there's an equivalence made between Roman and Greek ruins and Christ on a cross. This pushes forward into the 20th century. This is Adolf Appier's stage sets for Delacroix at Hellerau in Dresden, where a kind of bucolic landscape and the tragic are brought together in the stage set for Orphée, i.e. the descent into the underworld, light falling from above, the topography. And around about the same time, 1920s, Leverance and Asplund win the competitions for the new cemetery in Stockholm, next to a train station, a suburb which creates the need for mass burial, and effectively a way of trying to sacralize and situate engineering technology, steam engines and furnaces, in such a way that the Christian and pagan myths of Sweden can come together in a new image of tumuli, i.e. barrows, burial mounds, kind of classical language, and a kind of bizarre fusion of the two. So you get things like bus stops, classical bus stops, and kind of cut into barrows, the way of the cross. You need to speed up and zoom in a bit if I can try and get this to work. But in effect, what Leverance does is build a fake Viking burial mound, which incidentally hides the train station, and he creates a kind of mythic underworld. That's the fake tumulus which hides the graveyard. You essentially arrive eventually at the Chapel of Resurrection, which is arguably nothing more than a cave. The celestial orientation of the building, north, south, east, west, is offset to the terrestrial orientation of this path through the forest to it. It's articulated at the disjunction, something like true north and the solstice and Midsummer's Day, as Ez was alluding to. It's effectively a large sepulchre or tomb. You enter, the light at noon shines in, and you're effectively in a kind of mythical environment. At St. Peter's Klippan, I'm really sorry for the dreadful technological fuck-up that I've brought to bear with us. But in effect, that's rewritten, as it were, in the Church of St. Peter's at Klippan. That's the church. It's a kind of version of a cloister with community spaces, a pond, a park, the the western elevation. You process in like this, that's the altar, you turn, and as you leave, these drawings are effectively saying that this is kind of world of God and world of man. What you realise is that you're effectively in a cave. So the Christian myth of Christ laid to rest in the tomb and on the third day rising and being discovered, the things which are written into the Christian liturgy, where you go through the Last Supper, Good Friday, and then the resurrection, are rewritten in a Protestant context, Lutheran context. No Stations of the Cross, there's no paintings, but in effect a series of kind of catechism for the children of the parish. And so you emerge from a cave. And of course, in this, what you're really kind of dealing with then is the kind of image of the sky brought to earth in the pond. So the idea that God becomes man and man becomes God is brought together at the moment of the sacrifice and the myth. Some recent examples of this. This is Christos Papoulias' project for a museum of the Acropolis. The Acropolis has an escarpment around it, a man-made wall, and 19th century German archaeology revealed that there is a path running down to the Evertonian Theatre, which is filled with, it's a museum, it's a house of music, it's filled with statues of the dead. That has inspired all sorts of weird stuff. Chelida, this is a public sculpture, is a kind of barrow, kind of ceremonial pit in San Sebastian. At the end of the bay, he builds the wind cones just beyond the breakwater point, and at that moment, the action of the water pushes up through the ground and creates a kind of tuning between the wind, the sound of the wind, the water, and a kind of liminal condition where you're at the edge of the natural world and the human world. And this depth condition that he's trying to reveal spatializes itself in this unbuilt project for a kind of sacrificial burial mound on the foot of Ventura. Craig Hamilton has been building modern mausolea. This is in Highgate Cemetery. An angel at the gate, an angel within, light falling from above. So a kind of chthonic realm with light falling from above. And then there's this recent chapel on a hill in Oxfordshire overlooking the Thames Valley, where the idea of a kind of celestial realm linked to something below, in which the light of the word and the Christ-like figure of the word as light and embodied in man, as St. John says, is revealed as his farm. And there's James Turrell's Roland Crater, which I've not been to, but apparently is absolutely awesome. And similarly, seems to be operating at somewhere between art, religion, cosmology, science. And that brings us to what Tim is doing, where this is the sun rising on Saturday morning, and the thing that he'd set up happening, where to quote T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland, I will show you something worse than your shadow at morning rising to meet you, and your shadow at evening rising, falling before you. I will show you fear and a handful of dust. So there seems to be a kind of modernist poetics at play, I would argue, in what Tim's doing. He's probably embarrassed by this and thinks I'm talking guff, but I think it would be interesting, Tim, if you kind of talk us through this, because the light that falls into this thing, onto this individual columbarium, in fact, of ashes placed into a kind of celestial significance, suggests that which, as well as you going there, after this terrible period of plague passes, you're in the position now of building another mound, thinking about building a henge, and you're going to become, this becomes a social event. There's going to be a structure of things at play. And so I would kind of argue that where you're moving to is a kind of architectural project and an urban project. And I wonder if you could sort of talk us through how you kind of shift from the scale of an urn and something which is cosmic to something which has a kind of mediating middle scale of urbanity. It's probably worth you just kind of walking us through that. That was what I was kind of setting you up to do. Are you going to take over now, mate?
Patrick, why don't you stop sharing the screen and then we will see Tim.
How do I do that? the hour, Isaac.
I think I'm unmuted now.
Yeah, there you go.
We've got you.
Cool. Okay, so I think I'm being invited now to show you around the barrow, which is what I'm going to do. Before I go in, I'm just going to walk away from, there's a setting sun behind me, which you maybe will be able to pick out. It's actually going to set, I've been marking out the alignment for the setting sun because I feel I might need it later in what we're up to. Before I do, I think I'm just going to put a context around what we're doing, because a lot, this barrow is inspired by, if I stand like, I'll just let the barrow do some talking, get myself off the screen. If I put this in a context sorry, I'm just trying to move the screen a little bit whilst I talk. The inspiration for these is the late Stone Age, the dawn of farming, the dawn of architecture. I've been reading John Summerson, Ollie Wainwright was here and reviewed this monument for The Guardian, and actually knows, and Giles Smith did the gate for this. It's actually Giles Smith that gave me a copy of John Summerson's book when I was reading that. Within that, they talk about trying to get back to the sort of elemental first principles of it, and sort of, we were doing this about 200 years ago, and I'm not trained in architectural discourse, so you have to forgive me for that, but I think it got back to the Greeks, and then no one seemed to go back very much further, but there's obviously an architectural tradition in Britain that goes back a bit further. So I'll say a bit, and that's what we're relating to, the first farmers and the dawn of architecture, and I can feel some sort of companionship with those guys because I grow crops, and the landscape we're in here is quite an historic one, really. Behind me, so it's about 8 kilometers that way. Whoops, 8 kilometers that way. Oh, it won't work. It's that way is the Welsh border, and then the border with Powys before that. Behind me this way is Hawkston Hill, which is a Gothic landscape, which is quite interesting. And then this way, this Triassic sandstone ridge continues, and that's where Charles Darwin found his first fossils when he was a boy. So, but then you've got an Iron Age hill fort, which I was looking at earlier this morning behind me. But the Neolithic stuff, we found the odd bit of Neolithic flint in this landscape, but it's it hasn't survived so well because we have acidic soils and there's much more going on down sort of in Wiltshire. But there would have been, there are Neolithic monuments in this landscape, but they were destroyed, and you know, we're talking about 5,500 years of history has gone between us and them. So go back to Christ, double it, and add 500 years, and then you get to the guys that we're trying to sort of work with some sort of tribute to, or some sort of harmony with what they were up to. It's fairly flat landscape here because we're in glacial outwash. We have all of these different soil types in quite a high concentration. I'm not going to yak about farming because that's not what we're here for. This is the front of the barrow, which might be a bit flary because of the sun, but you can kind of make out that the stones came like that from the quarry. The masons, it's quite hard to persuade them to leave things quite rough, or they consider it rough, but I think that there's kind of ornamentation that is really attractive, and just using them as they came. And the more you make a stone like a Lego brick, the less you communicate with the original traditions. But as we go through this monument, which I'm going to do with you in a second, you're going to see some slightly different styles. Sorry, I have got a gimbal to try and get rid of lousy camera work. But this is a gate which Giles Smith designed for the barrow here, showing you. You can see chevrons and then these lozenge shapes. Those are all from prehistory. So the lozenge shapes are from actually a Bronze Age barrow, or emulating a Bronze Age barrow in the Stonehenge landscape. And then these chevrons are all over early ceramics from the Neolithic, in a lot of cultures all around the world, actually. So this gate opens and brings you into the first chamber. It's quite a short passage to this one, and we're going to rely on this camera. Last time I did this with Alice, it managed to turn the camera upside down. It became very irritating. But above me is a stone corbelled roof, which hopefully you're making out. And then that's sitting on a large ring beam, which I'm bringing into the shot now. And then we have these rows of niches, which are where ultimately families rest when the time comes. But this view behind me, it's not working as it did on the solstice morning. You haven't got the kind of golden light coming straight through here on this axis that flips around and takes you out that way. So that's the other side. This side's with the gate here, and then we come around in a circle, and then you've got this passage, which I'll take you through now. So there is, Patrick said there's 2 barrows. There's 2 chambers to 1 barrow. This is a passage area. All of this passage gets the light on the solstice, which comes to the top of this row of niches. So those 2 niches get the summer solstice sunrise light. And there's a bench on that side because we didn't want to be running some sort of, there needed to be some ability to be present in that, not just a passage, but somewhere to think. And then we're working here on this chamber, which we haven't completed yet. We're in a position to put a roof on here, but because of what's been happening, slightly taking a view that this might be a special moment where we can do some cultural things in a slightly safe setting with some air, because people can. There's no earth bank that rises to this ring beam. I'm just working on that at the moment. And then this behind me, there's an ammonite here, fossil, which if you go to some of the ancient barrows, Stony Littleton is the barrow which has had quite a bit of influence on this one, has an ammonite on the left-hand side as you go into it. So this is kind of connecting stone, because this is limestone, which was once living things. That's kind of an important theme, I think. And then through here, there's going to be a stained glass window here, which an artist is doing. We're not in a position to have that yet. And then behind me now, we've got this very long passage, which is about 12 meters long. And it's sort of, as you go through the barrow, it stops being, the beginning is quite archaeological, and then it gets a bit more so classical. I think this bit's quite modern, actually, very square, beautiful stonework the masons have put in here. But it leads out to this horizon. So if I spin this round, you'll see this is the reverse of the barrow. The earth isn't mounded up quite yet. There's a digger over here because work's going on. But that line, that axis coming this way, which is nearly but not quite 180 degrees from the rising sun on the solstice, the summer solstice. Behind me, there is a setting sun on the winter solstice, nearly 180 degrees, but not quite. You won't get it by eye, but they aren't quite 180 degrees. So this monument will look at the rising sun on the summer solstice and the setting sun on the winter solstice. And that was more for us about, I suppose there is on some level a connection with the, sorry, I'll try and get that camera so I'm not flaring the screen for you. There is on some level a connection with the cosmos, but one of the things I wanted to achieve was like an alarm clock that would go off in the landscape, so people would always feel that even if, I don't know, lots of things were going on and people had forgotten, the monument itself would remember, and the people within the monument would be remembered just by automatic operation of the universe kind of thing, and it will last thousands of years like that. And I mean, I will share an experience. I'm just keeping half an eye on the time. It's 1:45, so Ellis, jump in if you want me to stop talking. When I started on this, I'd got a sort of deep memory from my boyhood of being in North Wales and Anglesey looking at the original barrows. And that was relevant to me. But I also did, the main authorities that we've been using are what the guys were doing in the Neolithic and the early Bronze Age. And I happened to be up stupidly early in Wiltshire before I went to the new barrow that's been built in All Cannings, with sort of a lot of places I want to go to. And it was still dark on about the 20th of December. And I went to the Long Barrow at West Kennet, which is the biggest Long Barrow in the country. And it predates Stonehenge, it predates Silbury Hill. It's the dawn of people making monuments. And I went up there, as I say, before dawn, not properly understanding its orientations or what they were trying to say. I sat there and then I couldn't see it because it was dark. And then the sun rose, and it's actually its alignment is winter solstice sunrise there. And I kind of had this very strange sense that 5,500 years ago, somebody kind of expected someone to come into this landscape, sit there, and almost they, the builder, were putting their arm around your shoulder and then pointing at the horizon and say, look at this, it's cool. And it works 5,500 years on. Like, we don't speak the same languages. We don't, I suppose I understand some stuff about farming that they would regard as a challenge. but we managed to have a communication 5,500 years on. It was very simple, but also very profound. And as we've been building this, I think, you know, we've gone through a time where people have been quite tribal, and I think it's important that we try and find the things that we will agree on and try and treat each other with a bit more respect. And to make this something with some sort of sincerity and conviction behind it, I think the way to achieve that is to point at the things that we know are true. And these are fairly simple observations. The sun's going to get up there, it will do it for centuries, and it will set there, and it will do that for centuries. And there's a few more truths that we've been finding. You just kind of put them in the landscape as like a neutral comment, and then people can come here, and if they believe in a creator God, then that's part of that package, and that's what that God has done. Equally, if you don't believe in that, then you can respectfully sit with people and say, well, it's beautiful, and look at the amazing coincidence of our consciousness that we can see this thing, and how many sunrises are happening on planets that no one's watching them. And, you know, even a Dray Drift sunrise here is much more beautiful because someone's watching it than all the other planets having all the sunsets that are not being watched. So there's something kind of marvelous about humans, I think, though we don't always stop to reflect on that. And I think the way that we can make this something that is universal is to find these bits of things that are true. And that observation that someone made 5,500 years ago in West Kennet is like no less true now, and kind of no less profound. Conscious of time, there's 10 minutes left to go. I have to introduce something else. I'm going to walk up here with you and show you the view from the top of the barrow. When it's finished, this will be part of the design that you'll be able to come up here and see the views, which we're in sort of North Shropshire verging, and there's a kestrel just got up there. I don't know if you can see it. I'm just climbing up the barrow, which, you know, people do with the old ones, and completed new ones that they'd all cannings and watch the sun or whatever. So this is the landscape from up here. Not, you know, I think you climbed about 9 meters, but you've got a hell of an elevation, a hell of a view, really, for very little effort, frankly. So we're going to just have to make it safe. And there's the view back down onto, well, I'll get myself out of the way. That's the view for the second chamber. I'm stood on top of the first chamber as things stand. And then there's beyond that digger, that's right, there's a slightly taller oak. Whoops, this oak. We have to move about 600 tons of soil in total. First part of the construction allowed us to expand an existing pond and do this. And I think just gouging holes into the landscape and making ponds is kind of something. But we have the opportunity to say something a bit more. So when we put this, we started just here to make a bit of a henge monument. I'll be very clear that henge monuments are just ditches and banks, the early ones. And then standing stones are kind of nice to do. Also, you can add on, you can have standing stones without henges and henges without standing stones. We've got 3 standing stones in the landscape that bring you up here, kind of a Narnia sort of secret code to get here. If you know, then you know, and if you don't know, it's just a standing stone. Because that gets away from having lots of sort of bossy local authority style notices and liability waivers and all the rest of it. And they're beautiful things in and of themselves, and they're kind of a true but neutral thing. So when we do that, this is a lot to get into with only like 8 minutes to go. When we build this henge, we wanted to communicate something in the 21st century that is true and like invites you to wander. So that we were going to, when the constellation of Cygnus rises, we'll point to the nearest black hole that we know to in Cygnus X1, because we've only known that for about 60 years or so, maybe less. I don't know exactly. That's the stuff that Oxford is helping me with. And then behind it, we're going to do a sort of poetic representation of Young's double slit experiment, which will work on the equinoxes. It really isn't time to get into this, but that's about the duality of light between being a particle and a wave. If you look into it, then these quantum effects are all over biology. So photosynthesis, navigation of birds, your sense of smell, this is all using physics that we've only discovered in the last 50, 60 years. But 4.2 years of evolution have given us, like, you know, a blade of grass knows about these quantum effects, and we've only known about it for 60 years, which is wonderful, genuinely wonderful. It invites you to wonder at that. And if you, back to my previous point, if you've got belief in a creator God, that's part of the wonder and what they've done. And if you haven't, then you kind of approach it like Jim Al-Khalili or, you know, Brian Cox, and say, that's pretty awesome that we noticed that. And let's like sit on the same side of the table and wonder what it means. So we're just trying to find bits of truth that are kind of unifying and invite you to wonder. And we were going to move soil anyway. So, and we've kind of got permission to do something a bit creative here that I suppose if we hadn't built a barrow to start with, building a henge would be a bit weird, but it's quite natural to do it now. And it is a very sensible extension of what's already happened, and hopefully quite tolerant and unifying and gentle and all of those good things, which is what I would hope this thing will be. So that's my contribution with 5 or 6 minutes to go. I guess it goes to questions now, does it? Or
Beautiful.
Alice?
Let's just, if people have questions, then pitch them in the chat box, and I'll give you the microphone. Perhaps I could just to kind of kick off. I'm interested in, obviously, as you say, Tim, that the people, every individual at the moment is sort of responding to the possibility for ritual that your structure is presented in different ways. But I wondered if you sense that there's a sort of common culture emerging out of the way people are responding, that they're seeing how others have commemorated their loved ones, or what kind of rituals that they've performed. You must get asked a lot, how do people react?
Well,
to a commonality emerging.
The first thing I would say is that there's a kind of a conventional way of approaching this if you've got a Church of England background, which is pretty rapidly within, and this is not antagonistic to faith, the structure. I'd really hate anybody to think that. I think it's tolerant. So if you have faith, you should bring it here. And if you don't, then listen respectfully to that position. But so that was just a preface to what I'm about to say. So the conventional system within an Anglican setting is maybe within 2 weeks of a loss, you will have obviously things are slightly different now, but you'll have a funeral. And that's kind of it. If you look at other cultures, I had the enormous honor to go to a Jewish stone setting ceremony a couple of years ago for a dear friend, and that's about a year after the loss, when I think the family have processed things and everyone's at a slightly different place. They've gone through the raw loss, and then people have got sort of a bit more perspective to share stories and things. They will gather to raise stone on the grave, and I think that's kind of beautiful. And I suppose in a lot of ways it's a new ritual here, in that you get an opportunity to say, firstly, there's a community here, because as I was saying, the structure's like an alarm clock. There were a dozen people joined the live stream of the rising sun here on the summer solstice, from distant places, and they had an opportunity to remember that person. And our culture did have space for this for a long time with the All Souls Day, and if you look at other cultures down in South America with the Day of the Dead and things, or Chinese have an approach where, but we've lost that. There isn't a day when we do remembering ancestors. So this is kind of allows people to have permission to do that, and for it not to be strange, and to know that a conversation that might otherwise be mawkish or uncomfortable is one that everyone who's engaging with this is open to. Remembering people that they've lost, and comforting people who are grieving, who might be closer to it than you may be yourself if you're a few years beyond your immediate loss. I think that's quite nurturing and quite worthwhile for the families that are involved. And then because we've got the way the niches are closed, people are commissioning artists to do stained glass windows or paint stones, or so they get to engage with creative people and do something which isn't laser cut machine worded imported Chinese marble, something very sincere and beautiful. It's like the ceramics. People have taken clay from this barrow and made their own pots, or had people use the original Neolithic techniques. And without sounding vulgar, there's a budget around when we lose people, and instead of it going into like an industrialized process, we can do beautiful and meaningful things that are just, they hold people a bit more. And I've been watching that happen, and obviously it's deeply painful, some of what happens related to this monument, but it's also, you can see circles getting closed and arms being put around shoulders, and is nurturing and beautiful. And people can have some sort of human acceptance of our mortality, I guess. I'm trying not to sound pretentious. I'm trying to sound like a farmer when I talk, but the words are not, they're big words, there's big concepts. We'll try and keep it quite wholesome and low to the ground, I think. Have I answered the question? I don't even remember what it was.
I guess just one more from me, but it'd be lovely if there were questions from the audience, because I was just, Patrick, I mean, maybe if I come back to you, just obviously the experience that Tim's, this extraordinary structure that Tim's made, the fact of it being outside the city is absolutely sort of fundamental to its power, that it has this, it kind of can place you in relationship to sort of an archaic structures by virtue of the fact that the modern world isn't present. You were showing, among your rapid fire slideshow, there was sort of the Pantheon crept up as a one example that was absolutely in the city, and yet sort of was oriented towards cosmic reality. I said to Patrick, but maybe the question for both of you, can you see that there are kind of lessons from the Sacred Stones project that one could apply to a more urban condition?
I think that one thing that's really clear in Joseph Wickvert's book, The Idea of a Town, is that the relationship between the necropolis and the city of the living is quite clear. As you pointed out, it's kind of beyond the city wall. It's very obvious in London. Spitalfields is the burial ground that kind of runs around the outskirts of the city wall for reasons of hygiene. And I was intrigued. I don't know if I kind of put this into Tim's head, but the idea that the birth of agriculture is the birth of architecture is that's a very particular and quite a precise reading. I think that one theory that Peter Carl elaborates in his essay Ornament and Time is that what agriculture produces is the countryside and what's not the countryside, and the first thing that's not the countryside is the storage shed. And the theory goes that the invention of the priest class or caste is effectively a way of creating a taboo about the earth's produce that needs to last you for through the lean months of winter. And the grain store creates a kind of need for a threshold, and that threshold has rituals around it. And that from that you develop then law, education, or kind of civic institutions that we recognise as a vanity. So yes, I think the idea that architecture and agriculture are absolutely fused is correct. And I suppose what Tim is doing is kind of starting from something, an urn, a barrow, cosmic alignment, and moving outwards. And what I'm interested in challenging Tim to try to do, because there's no drawings of this, but his drawings of bits of structure, is to try to situate it. And I think the relationship to the pond, the various trees, Wales over there, various hills, and the fact that, as you alluded to, Tim, the sensation you got alone a few years ago in Winchester you know, is not an individualistic one. I mean, you know, it's no happenstance that Glastonbury, the music festival, occurs at the solstice, and that I suppose what you're setting up is a kind of modern ritual and a community, and thus is social. And so the scale of relationships between the absolutely sacred, the absolutely profane, at some point, I think you're going to get into the kind of question of, you alluded to building regulations and planners, but then health and safety and toilets and you know, the whole plethora of coach stops and all that shit that defines the plane of Stonehenge, and various attempts to deal with that as a functional problem. But what I'm interested in is this kind of symbolic hierarchy where everything is part of a story that's being told about man's situation in relationship to food and to death, i.e. to energy. And I think that's what you're sensing as an individual. And I suppose what I'm really interested in is the idea that that's essentially what architecture is this kind of horizon of encounter of selfhood, both in incredibly personal, physical, phenomenologically situated, and also something much bigger than yourself. One dimension of which is ritual. That might be, you know, codified in the Christian Mass, or other diurnal and weekly rhythms of Judaism and Islam, etc., etc. But there's also this kind of wonder that you're alluding to, which is a shared experience of being human, and that, you know, as a farmer, kind of encountering this depth, I think it's kind of putting you in this kind of strange position where you're not priest class, you're not architect, you're not just modern capitalist landowner. You know, there's some other kind of dimension of being that's stirring, isn't there? That this is a sort of experiment for. I'm just kind of curious about at what point this becomes kind of a project, and therefore becomes drawn. I'm not pitching for work, because I think this is like a lot of things I do, a really good way of losing lots of money in a kind of attempt to find some depth in the modern world. But I think your observation that agriculture and architecture are kind of there is where you're moving towards. I just think there's a civic dimension to this, and a communal experience that the more people are buried there. I mean, you said the other week to me, Tim, you know, that there seems to be this thirst within the human species for something over the horizon, beyond that which can be understood in materialistic terms. Now, if you kind of disavow the religious, per se, but allow the sacred, as Corbusier suggested, you get into this anthropological frame of mind where you say this stuff is significant to people, or it's significant to me, and then significant to more people like me, and so it becomes a form of cultural communication and articulate. I mean, I'm not suggesting you're kind of creating a religion, but you are making space for something like a profound experience of other people.
I think that's fair. I think part of this is a response to how it's easy to be critical, and there are good cemeteries and bad cemeteries, but they can be incredibly dispiriting and underwhelming spaces, and there isn't much wonder in them. They are kind of shoved between a bypass and a roundabout and some pylons, and they're sort of fenced off, and they're not living and they're not celebrated.